Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Eidson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. 1 year ago, all procurement could talk about was digital transformation. Enter the pandemic, and many of those plans were really thrown overboard. But the reality is that the pandemic has actually accelerated the underlying need to digitize procurement. And I see that on a regular basis, where technology business cases that were previously held up or perhaps not prioritized are now actually being approved and accelerated. And so in today's podcast, I'm going to share with you the recording from an AOP Live webinar that I hosted last month with Christopher Eyerman, the Head of Procurement Innovation at Denali, who are a W&S company, and David Clevenger, who is their Director of Procurement and Operational Excellence. Now, our webinar was based on a guidebook that the team at Denali had built called A CPO's Roadmap for Digital Transformation. We cover a number of topics, including how procurement can get the digital journey started, and do that in reality, not just in theory. And we talk about the types of change management investments that procurement needs to make in order to ensure that transformation is actually successful and, obviously, really importantly, sustainable. Now, to download the guidebook that underlies the conversation, you can go to artofprocurement.com/Denali book. That's all one word. That's artofprocurement.com/Denali book. Now, I'll take you straight into the webinar. And my first question for Chris, where I asked him if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
I started my career as an engineer launching satellites. So I guess I didn't initially choose procurement, although in those days, even I remember we did our own purchasing and procurement. And I remember touring the country and finding suppliers and negotiating with suppliers for everything from solar panels to actuators and mechanisms. Since then, after my MBA, I connected with a small, interesting company called Free Markets, which is one of the companies that helped to pioneer the reverse auction. Is really where I got my introduction to procurement 20-some years ago, and that's really started my journey in procurement.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Free Markets. We were just talking before we went live here about procurement 20 years ago, and really that was the beginning of the Free Markets era. We're starting to talking about technology and reverse auctions, and for many of us, that's where kind of these digital journeys began. Now, the same question, David, for you as well. If you could just share a little bit about your background, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Yeah, I'd say in one way, very dissimilar from Chris. I wasn't doing anything close to being a rocket scientist. Mm-hmm. But no, I was in the financial services space, working in securities, and also came across Free Markets as a company that was just doing some very new, very exciting things. I didn't really even associate it at that point with procurement as much as I did with really exciting advancements in technology and the use of technology. Mm-hmm. So I would say that I was hoodwinked a bit by procurement, but it's been a great 20 years.
Well, yeah, 20 years later, you stuck with it. So
there we
are. So I want to go straight into the first topic, and the first topic we want to talk about today is really getting that digital journey started. And the first question is really, I think in fact the first couple of questions are more kind of contextual. And I'm going to ask first for you, David, and this is a question that came in from Juliet, and that's what's even the first step to digitization?
Yeah, I would say that the first step is to actually set the digital component of it aside, and to really look at your ecosystem and to look at your whole business, and what we talk a lot with our clients about what's your North Star. What is the direction of your company? Not even just your procurement group, but your company as a whole. And where are you? And to be able to do a very candid assessment of where you are currently versus your ability to address and achieve those objectives. And the clear purpose, what's going to guide your roadmap is not just that clear understanding of where you are, but what is a fit for purpose solution to where you're going, because you don't want to overestimate what you're going to need from a digitization standpoint. You clearly don't want to underestimate it either. So that first step in the process really is that clear look at all of your capabilities, all of your objectives, and creating a strategy around that into which you will assimilate the technology.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you start to think about doing that, there's a term that is used with more frequency. I would say, I'm going to come over to you, Chris, and just ask you about this. We hear a lot about digital roadmaps. And for some folks, they hear about digital roadmaps and makes sense straight away, understanding what it is. But in other cases, I know that certainly we come across this, I'm sure you come across it as well, a little bit of confusion about what a digital roadmap actually looks like. So as much from a level setting perspective as anything else, I just wonder if you could explain what you think and see when you use the term digital roadmaps.
Yeah, definitely important to set that context for this discussion. I'll just start with picking up where David left off there is, we're going to focus this discussion around the digital roadmap. We'll talk about what that is, but it needs to be considered in the context of your overall procurement roadmap. And what that means, your overall procurement strategic plan, like where are you going as a procurement organization? As David indicated, the first clear step in that process is having a clear vision about where you need to go. What do you want to be when you grow up in the next 3 to 5 years as a procurement organization? Yeah. And now within that overall vision, within that overall view, we're now going to look at how technology plays a role in that vision, and then ultimately the actions we take to get there and achieve that. That needs to be highly integrated with the business and the business functions. This isn't something procurement is doing in a vacuum. It needs to be tightly integrated with the business, and it needs to consider, David mentioned this term of an ecosystem. So technology is something we're focusing on today, but the ecosystem also embodies, what about the competencies of our people? What about our processes? What about our operating model and our policies? What about our suppliers, our key stakeholders within the business, executives within the organization? That's the entire ecosystem that we need to consider where technology is a component of that. So now putting that in the form of a roadmap, it starts with a vision. Where do we want to be? And let's articulate that in some very discrete ways around, making that actionable, not just a broad visionary statement, but what do you really want to look like that's unique for you as an organization? And then based on our assessment of the current state, we're now going to create a set of action plans and key outcomes over the next, say, 3 to 5 years that's going to allow us to meet that vision. And again, those key outcomes all tie back to the technology dimensions, but also the people component, the process component, the operating model component, all adding up to a strategic plan that meets our vision.
So as you think about, you talked about process and people a lot as well as the technology, what are some of the pitfalls that you see when an organization may just look at it from a technology perspective and they're not really taking into account the full picture? What does that lead? Either what does that lead you to, or what's the likelihood that leads you towards?
So I think, David, I'll let you chip in too, but it's really about the journey. And so we think about this roadmap, this journey of procurement, and where digital is a component of that. And our goal with the journey all along is to drive value for the organization, period. And that value is going to tie back to what the organization's asking of us. But the way to make it sustainable and ongoing is all of the elements that we talked about. It's the pitfall is only looking at technology, jumping on the shiny object to go implement something because it's cool or because you've been challenged to do so, without considering the broader elements of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I would just add on to that, that we look at each one of those sort of key pillars of strategy, people, process, and technology, and your maturity within each one of those. And where that becomes an issue is if you have significant variation between those. So to be a very high-level technologically enabled firm, when your process and people and your strategy are much less mature, we say internally, it's like giving a Nerf gun to a Navy SEAL. That doesn't work, right? Yeah. And similarly, giving a grenade launcher to a child is a very dangerous proposition. So we really look at that uniform progression across each one of those pillars and your maturity to make sure that your people, your processes, your strategy, everything is aligned and at that same or at least close to the same level as your technology strategy.
And so would you say if you look at that, you do that assessment and whether it's people, whether it's process, there's something that it truly isn't at the maturity that it needs to be. Is the focus, the recommendation on, let's start there first. Let's not even worry about digitization, or perhaps it's, let's take a different approach. Maybe we think you can use some technology, but it's going to be very small, very targeted, specific use case while you're building up your maturity in the people and the processes, rather than trying to go with the big bang on tech and you have the consequences of people and process not being ready.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. And Chris obviously chime in on this as well, but I think it's definitely, there's always a strategy for each. So you should never be idling. You should never be at zero on the technology side. But I think the degree to which you are able to roll that out, to which you're able to take advantage of everything a piece of technology can do, is going to be dependent at some point, or limited by, at some point, the maturity of the other aspects of your business.
Right.
Yeah, maybe it might be helpful to talk a little bit more about some of those dimensions, like what is complexity, or what is maturity. We talked about obviously the technology components of that, where, hey, where are you today with your technology? What do you have in place across source to contract, procure to pay? What point solutions might you have? What's the connectivity between those systems, et cetera? But, putting that aside and looking at kind of the enablers to make this sustainable, a couple areas that I think are really critical, process. What's the level of your process standardization, the adoption of those processes, locally, globally, and how well they're optimized, number one. Number two, data. And we think about data maturity as well. Where are you with your data? At the foundation of it, data and information is what automation and technology is trying to operate on. It's trying to bring the right data and information in the best form, quality, to the right people to make decisions and drive insights, right? I mean, that's at the core of it. So getting a handle on your data maturity and understanding where it is and getting it in a good form it's usable is another critical enabler. And then the third, I would say, is organizational readiness, is the people component, the digital IQ of the organization. Do you have a culture that is technologically savvy? Do you have an organization that's open to experimenting and it has a little bit of risk tolerance to be able to try some new things and experiment? Do you have the right skill sets within your people? So I would say there are other dimensions of the ecosystem, but I think when we think of that maturity, those are probably the three areas that would stand out.
Now there was a question from Wayne, and I'm kind of going to build on this question. The question was, what does good look like? He's a very small government contractor, and what if I can't afford Fortune 500 level solutions? I'm kind of going to take that question and just maybe rephrase a little bit to think about the point solutions versus the suite solutions. And it's being, a debate, a question within procurement technology for 20 years that I can remember. But as you're starting to think about that digital journey and building the roadmap, where would you recommend people start on that journey of, let's just we're going to look at small things, we're going to look at small best of breed versus, I just want one of the big guys. Is that a conversation or a decision that should be made at the beginning of the journey, or should you be guiding your way up to making that decision later, if you will? I don't know which one of you, David, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I know Chris has some very specific opinions on the platform versus the point solutions, and I'll let him comment on that. I think at some level, though, I think the important thing to remember I think you said Wayne's specific question, is defining good is that it solves your issues, right? So good for you and good for someone else. I think it's very dangerous, especially in the context of digitization, to start to compare yourself with larger organizations or more mature organizations, because you are going to fall into this trap where you're starting to develop a solution or implement a solution that really wasn't designed for a company like yours. And so I think, just to always keep in mind that, the best solution is the one that solves your problem. I think in terms of the platform versus the point solutions, the significant difference there is really impact. But Chris, I don't know, you want to expand on that piece a little bit more?
Yeah, I think when we think about building a foundation, and we'll refer back to that quite a bit, is how do you get started? Well, pay attention to your fundamentals, which are some of the things we talked about, process and people, et cetera. But, building your foundation from a technology standpoint, includes some of those core elements. And I think that's probably without regard to the size of the organization. And those are a couple of things. I mentioned the data is an important element of the process building blocks. But from a technology standpoint, your core platforms are pretty important. That typically means your source to contract platforms, your procure to pay. And they're so important because they're foundational. They're going to handle the bulk of the core processes that you're doing. And you want to get those in place to begin with. Now, Wayne, I'm not sure how small an organization you are. That may warrant going with one of the major providers, a Fortune 500 solution, but maybe not. If you're a small organization, there are lightweight end-to-end solutions or procure-to-pay packages that you can find that are better suited for a middle market or a smaller organization. It doesn't have to be a Fortune 500 platform, but I would encourage you, handling those core processes as the foundation, because later on we're going to talk about, now how do we take that to the next level, and introducing point solutions and leveraging other RPA and other artificial intelligence and ways to further automate that platform. But those cores are pretty important. And finally, I would just say on that, you mentioned, the end-to-end versus the point solution. I don't think, I think that's an individual decision. There are some good end-to-end providers. My opinion is, I think in many cases you're better off, finding the right fit for your organization. And in many cases, it doesn't make sense to go with a complete expect one platform to cover that whole spectrum. You're better off, building that, for your organization.
So I have a question from Kelly. If you'd like to jump in, I think you have a question from the audience.
Sure. And this question comes in from Pavan. And I think given the things that we've been talking about, I actually really appreciate the honesty of this question. So David, maybe we'll start with you on this, and then we can pass to Chris for some additional thoughts. And he's saying, given the situation, if a procurement organization is less mature across all three of these categories within the ecosystem that we're talking about, so if they have limited technology already deployed, little to no process and policy already in place, and perhaps talent is a concern, so if all three areas need some help, even if they are aligned at the lower end of the maturity spectrum, how does a CPO figure out where they should start investing first?
Oh, it's a great question. So I would say the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is to determine where that organization is trying to go and what they're trying to be as they go forward. So again, if for whatever reason, just as an example, something like commodity expertise is a core component of their business and something they really feel that they need to stress and get better at, then the people piece is maybe going to be prioritized a bit above maybe technology or process. But I think, as we said earlier, the best approach almost always is to try and move uniformly, that you're doing things in such a way that you're not over investing or overcompensating in one area, but you're trying to make sure you're making that common progress across all three of those areas, so that as your people are getting better, they're working within more defined and effective processes, utilizing and becoming more efficient through the application of better technology. So it might feel a little slower than saying we're just going to get great at the people piece right out of the gate and let everything else sort of trail it. I'd prefer a more uniform approach.
And what do you think, Chris? Anything to add there, maybe specifically around, obviously we don't know exactly what kind of an organization Pavan works in, but would it matter based on the industry that they're in, how they compare to their competitive peers? Should it be an externally driven decision about where to focus, or would you recommend procurement really stop and look internally where they are compared to best practice to figure out how to either move all three of these areas along or decide where to focus?
Yeah, well, as strong advocates of the ecosystem, I don't think you can look at those independently. You have to consider where you are internally and how it fits in the external market. I think less so. I think David pointed out early on, forget about the benchmarks. They're a useful reference point to kind of see what other people are doing and understand where there are good practices. But what's really important is your situation, especially if you're finding yourself at the lower end of the maturity spectrum across many areas. Like what are you trying to do? Where's your business going, and what's most critical? In this environment, it could be we need savings. We need to shore up our supply chain to reduce the risk and the volatility that we have right now. Okay, well, there you go. There's your focus for the immediate term. And then how you go about solving that could be, you enlist some help, you kind of pull your team together, you maybe leverage some technology to try to understand your data and spend, and you kind of go after, sourcing and negotiation to get that savings. But I think, to David's points from the outset of this question, it's really has to start from what does the organization need from you?
All right, thanks, Kelly. Any other questions that have come in yet?
We do actually have another question, but it works very nicely with the next section of topics that we're going into. So I'm gonna hold it and insert it into that flow once we get into it.
All right, perfect. Well, I want to move into really talking about change management. And there's actually a question that, where I'm going to start, and actually I'm going to ask you this, Chris. There was a question from Peter, and Peter said, let's talk about the 80-20 rule as we think about all the different applications that we can invest in as a procurement organization. Are there any that have more value over the others, from an ROI perspective, or if you can only invest in one area? Now, I know part of me thinks, well, the answer is it depends, but I'd just love to get some of your perspective. And for context, Peter works in an electric utility.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for the question, Peter. I would say we actually did a recent benchmark study, and found that many organizations are pursuing digital today. I think we all know that, but it's pretty striking to see that there is about, I think, less than 28% of organizations that would say that they're really getting value today, are getting value in adoption. So, with the one point about the response to Peter's question is that it's almost too early. The jury's still out on many of these areas. That said, my perspective, I would say, I think of two areas as those that are going to drive the most value. And I think we've talked about some of this already. The first is thinking about the core platforms that you have in terms of setting that foundation. I'm not speaking specifically in terms of direct ROI, but the fact that they are so foundational in terms of addressing the core of your of your processes and setting the right foundation. So now you're going to bring in additional automation and value to the organization, and they enable other areas. So your core source to contract and P2P platforms, I would say, are more valuable because they're foundational and then will influence value all along. The second area is data and analytics. And I've already pointed out that data is the key enabler to really all pieces of value that procurement's going to drive. Whether it's sourcing, whether it's driving another level to your category strategy, it's informing better contract negotiations, it's identifying leakages and non-compliances in your procurement processes, it's identifying overpayments, it's surfacing data and information that's going to now fuel that strategic cycle again. So if anywhere you're going to kind of put your money, especially early on, but then throughout is it getting your data and analytics in order and getting that in a position where it can be actioned on, and it can fuel and actually kind of help to support the value that will drive the rest of your investments.
All right, thanks, Chris. No, I think these are some really interesting and important questions. One that I want to ask, and actually I'll come over to you, David, as well. This is really fundamental to me, and it's around change management, because as we've talked about from the very beginning, the confluence of the people, process, technology, all being very important in tandem. As we think about digital transformation, we have a number of people who ask very similar versions of this question. And that's, what are some of the change management best practices that actually support that transformation from paper to digital, while ensuring that we're bringing in, we're engaging the entire company in this change?
Yeah, I can start off with, I think the first thing, probably the most important thing, is to not think about this change management process differently just because you're talking about technology. That the fundamentals of good change management are consistent, and that you need a solid open communication, and you need an effective training plan, and you need to make sure you're engaged with all key stakeholders throughout the organization. All of those things need to be included, and not distinguished just simply because, well, this is technology, is suddenly does change management become a different thing. And then I think the transparency component of it, I think the key for individuals as they go through this process, and where change tends to fall down, is that individual users, people who are affected by the change, don't really see how it's relevant to them. So they understand sort of the broad sweeping terms of, this is more efficient, this is good for the company, this is advanced, it's modernization, but they don't really see, okay, what does this really mean to me as an individual? And as you're putting those communication plans together and you're defining that messaging, making sure that you're not giving one message to all of your stakeholder groups, that you're tailoring that message so that it is in fact relevant to each group. And then lastly, I would say, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier, is you're developing the solution itself, that you've captured what your leadership's vision is for the business, and that's kind of the top-down influence on what this looks like. But you've also engaged in what's actually happening and how work is getting done, so that there's a bottoms-up message as part of that communication as well. And those two things combined are ultimately what's going to enable that change to be effective.
And Chris, I just want to give you the opportunity if there's anything else you wanted to add on to that, because before I have a follow-up for David.
Just adding to that, I mean, it's the fundamentals of change management, but don't forget your suppliers and the other aspects of your ecosystem. That's all part of fundamental change management, is understanding all of your stakeholders. But oftentimes we'll forget about suppliers. I remember back in the early 2000s, when all the e-procurement platforms were being deployed and everybody was forgetting about suppliers and supplier enablement, for example. The other thing I would say is that it might be a good opportunity to kind of use this change to maybe rebrand procurement. Not just from the technology foundation, that's a component of it, but think about maybe rebranding procurement within the organization. Depending if you're where you started as an organization, people may think about procurement as purchasing, or the place where I have to go to slow my contract negotiation process down. So it's a good opportunity now to think about that as part of your change program. Is think about rebranding and using some of these building blocks of technology where you're now going to make the experience of the stakeholders a lot more streamlined and start to change that perception in the organization.
You said the word there that I'd actually written down about experiences, and the kind of the experiential side of procurement, because you go into it. When you have these change journeys, you often go and you find an organization that maybe they've used some technology in the past. It's not been the best. Like I say, everyone kind of looks at that as being a procurement problem. And there are actually pretty simple, small things that can make big differences in the experiences of stakeholders, because it just helps them from their cycle time of how to place a PR, go from a purchase rec to a PO, or you don't need to do big things to make a big difference. When you start thinking about the experiences that your stakeholders have. So I think that's really important. David, I want to come back to you because I had a follow-up just on kind of the conversation that we had before. And this, again, is kind of from some personal experiences, is you put together a project plan for a digital implementation for either a single technology that you're bringing in, whether you bring in a suite, whatever it looks like. And let's say your the project plan is I'm just going to make a number up, like a 5-month process. And then you're going and saying, well, actually, I recommend this should be more like 7 months because we've got to think about the change. We've got to make sure we're building in time at the very beginning because we need to get people on board and engage and tell the story and work on some of the branding things. It's not just all about how long is it going to take to make sure that all the pipes are fit together from a data perspective. And when people look at that, they often say, you know what, that's too long. Let's just go with the 5 months because that's how, and let's you can do the change management as you go. I just wondered how you kind of push back on that and to really iterate the importance of change management, because it always feels, in my experience, when people are looking for ways to cut the timeline to do implementation, that's where they look to cut.
I think you're exactly right. I'd say one of the great advantages of being a third-party consultant is we just get to look at people and go, well, that's a huge mistake that you're about to make. We don't necessarily have to manage through the politics that the folks on the inside do and the budget challenges that I know they have. But we talk a lot, obviously, about sustainability of a solution. And change and communication are such key elements. They are the core elements of sustainability. And those project plans, especially as it relates to these investments, really have to begin with your communication strategy and your change management strategy. The way, as you say, all the pipes connect together. I'll stop short of saying that's the easy part. But we know these technologies work. Right? We know what they can do. We know they're effective. They still fail in certain companies. And the reason for that is not because the software doesn't work. It's because you didn't take the time to do these things. And I think as you're trying to sell this internally to your leadership, my experience has been that most C-level leaders within organizations respond to a couple of things, growth and risk. And I think if you can demonstrate for them, and I think you can in an area like this, the very real risk of shortchanging your communication and change management plan, and that it puts their investment in the technology at risk, then that's a potential way to sell that.
Yeah, and Kelly, I'm going to come to you in a moment, I think, for a couple of other questions, but I just wanted to kind of round up this topic on change management. And I think it's a nice segue when you talk about kind of investment at risk, if you will, to a question that we actually got around investment. I'm going to ask this to you, Chris, and this is from Marchetta. Marchetta was talking specifically about advanced analytics tools. And the question essentially is, how can you make the business case for investment in things like advanced analytics tools when oftentimes, they don't, when people look at them, they think, well, that should be a given. You should be able to do that anyway. You don't need more money to get better tools to help you do analytics. Why can't you just use an Excel spreadsheet? How do you make that business case? What are some of the ways you've seen companies be successful in making the business case for investment in tools like that?
Yeah, great question. Did you say that data is not sexy? I didn't understand that. I'm an engineer.
That was the question, wasn't it?
That's my background, right? It is a challenge because, it's I think I talked about already, data and especially the analytics and trying to bring insights and bring your data to a form where it's together, it's normalized, it's cleansed, it's in an actionable form is not necessarily the part that derives value directly, but it is an enabler to everything that we're doing in procurement. You're not going to find opportunities. You're going to build your sourcing portfolio. You're going to dig into your spend. You're going to understand how your categories are fragmented. You're going to understand where you have, price variances across different purchased items. And that's what's going to surface the opportunities that go into your pipeline. You need the data to find out when are my contracts expiring and then how fragmented am I, so that I'm not just going to go renew a supplier contract, but I'm going to now, consolidate suppliers and then rationalize my terms because now I've got rich information, insight that's going to say, your terms are all over the board when it comes to even suppliers within a category. So it's so foundational to every piece of value that procurement is driving. You need to build up the business case based on that and tie back to where are we going in the first, what are we trying to drive to? Is it savings? Mm-hmm. Are we trying to drive to be more strategic? Are we trying to reduce the risk in the organization? To David's point, are we trying to help support the organizational growth and put us in procurement in a position to be more agile and more flexible so we're not slowing down the growth, but we're supporting and helping to drive the expansion of the business? Align your data objectives to exactly what the outcomes we're trying to drive and paint that picture that says you're not going to get to that value, or you're not going to get to the value that you could be reaching without really good, data and analytics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you say, it's so fundamental. And still 20 years later, it's a topic we still seem to be struggling with as procurement groups.
If anything, I think that's an area that there's, some of these technologies are really have a way to impact now is machine learning algorithms to help auto classify spend and bring the data together, kind of advanced algorithms to start looking at areas of, not just describing my spend, here's the historical view, but also now casting that forward and integrating that with the company's business. It might be your manufacturing plan, and now being able to cast forward, what's my spend going to be going forward in the future? And you're really changing the mindset of the organization. You're changing what you can do, as a procurement function, not just being reactive and backward looking, but now pivoting and now putting yourself in a position where you can be more proactive and forward looking.
Yeah, you can start driving optionality based on predictive analytics. And I think we're going to go there in the next topic. But before we do, I just want to stop and hand over to you, Kelly. I know you got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience.
I do have a few questions that have come in. And Chris and David, let me preface these 3 questions by saying I think it's safe for me to brag and say that the AOP Live audiences are the best. But we clearly have a really bold group of people interested in pushing forward, because these 3 questions that I have that have come in on this topic, these folks are ready to go. So the first one, David, let me start with you. I have a question that's come in from Bernice. And as we were talking about change management, she's basically saying, yes, procurement can take some certain steps to handle the change management effort, to minimize disruption, right? But what if procurement wants to be disruptive? What if they take this digital roadmap, this digital journey as an opportunity to be disruptive internally, to embrace innovation, potentially even by working cross-functionally? And she specifically mentions operations. So how would you alter maybe some of the advice or expand on some of the advice you've given around change management if procurement is less looking to contain the instability and more looking to really drive some big changes?
No, I mean, I think, look, we kind of have joked about it a little bit throughout the conversation so far, but I think a lot of people in our space are frustrated by the status quo and the fact that reputationally procurement probably isn't where we hoped it would be when we started this 20 plus years ago. And so I applaud anybody whose vision is inclusive of procurement being a positive disruptor in their business. And I think the opportunity is clearly there. And as Chris just sort of outlined and Phil both just outlined, the advancements in some of the tools that we're talking about here, the ability to do that has expanded significantly. But I think the first part of that is if you're going to be a disruptor, you have to first establish credibility. You have to demonstrate that you, in fact, have something to offer that's worth everybody else in your business listening to, whether that's operations, it's other stakeholders, it's your leadership. A lot of that, and again, I know some of this keeps coming back to points we've touched on, but how able are you to interpret the data? How predictive are your analytics? Are you able to bring something to the table that is valuable enough that you can rally around that as your the center of your disruptive strategy? And then I would also say that there's an element that I think most procurement departments miss around how do you then market, communicate, and brand this effort? And, let's be perfectly candid. Most of us in the procurement space, that's not our core competency. We're not marketeers. We're not salespeople. We're not as commercially minded as we always should be. But most organizations have that capability within their company. And I've seen multiple examples throughout my career of procurement departments who go into their own organizational marketing department to develop a branding plan for procurement. And you can introduce, these are the processes we want to disrupt. These are our themes. And those folks are experts at developing the messaging around that and how to campaign around that and how to communicate around it. So don't sit there in procurement when you're looking at such an aggressive strategy and feel that you're trying to do this on your own. Talk to finance, talk to marketing, talk to the people who are experts in your organization to introduce a credible strategy to the rest of your business.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up this notion of procurement not being experienced in self-branding, self-marketing. And Derek makes an interesting point on this, that so often was missing in these change management efforts, or at least missing in the ones that lack success, is strong sponsorship from the very top. And he actually makes the comment that many folks, I'll put this in, right, Derek, hopefully this is what you intended, many within procurement don't at the end of the day want to be the ones with the blood on their hands, as he says. So Chris, in terms of that, bringing in folks from other functions, getting the leadership buy-in, how can procurement make the case to leadership that we can not only change our own value proposition, but we can actually alter the trajectory of the competitive advantage of the entire company?
Yeah, well, I think building off what David said is you have to earn your way to that discussion. You're not going to go flip the switch from, hey, we're a reactive contract pushing organization, and now, hey, just based on what we're saying to you, that now we're going to now start influencing the corporation. I think you have to build up that credibility. I think many of the things we had talked about today to start highlighting that value. I think everybody on this call is probably pretty aware of the value that procurement can bring when it's done well, when it's done strategically, both in terms of driving savings, which still drives many of us today, in terms of that type of value that we can bring to the organization, but also other organizations that is not as relevant. It's more about speed. It's about minimizing the risk to the organization. So find some elements that you can start to demonstrate to the organization and to the leadership to get their attention. I would certainly leverage analytics as a way to kind of fuel that, but find some projects, whether it's a key project, savings initiative to kind of highlight to an organization, or find a way to drive, market intelligence and to assess your suppliers and be able to highlight some key risks that you can avoid some pitfalls, to highlight that to the organization. So find some building blocks where you can start to highlight that value and start to work your way towards earning that position.
Yeah, and let's stay with that.
Quickly.
Oh, go ahead, David.
I'm sorry, Kelly. I would just add quickly to that list that Chris just went through, because I think it's something we're just now finally starting to see companies do in terms of what some of those things are, but also look outside your organization at your supplier community. The innovation that can be brought into your organization from your suppliers, your thousands of suppliers that are working with you every day, is significant. And I think it's an area that is still too often missed and can be facilitated and better quantified by a lot of the digital tools that people are looking into.
And David, on that exact point, I'm actually going to sort of paraphrase a question that's come in from Daniel, but specifically on the point of collaboration with suppliers. Do you see the capabilities and maturity of anything that might be in the category of supplier portal helping with that? So is this an area where technology can help us to progress along that maturity curve? Or is it something that needs to be sort of a people first, process first kind of an effort?
I think that technology will be a very significant enabler in this over the next 2 or 3 years. I think we've already, Chris and I both have already seen examples of tools that there are some startups in the space that are creating some very exciting tools that are going to help take supplier management to the next level, to not just simply be what they've been in the past, onboarding, maybe something that just, a scorecarding functionality. Not that those things are unimportant. They're all part of a broader supplier management strategy. But I think to the question that Daniel asked, I think we're already starting to see much more, the development of much more advanced tools that will help serve as those enablers. But again, just enablers. So to the point you ended on there, Kelly, the fundamentals of building relationships with key suppliers, that doesn't go away just because you have a better tool set. That'll help your communication. It will help your quantification of improvements that you're making with those suppliers, all of those things. But it certainly won't supplant the need for focused relationships and strong strategy and fundamentals.
And as we try to think more and more expansively, Chris, this next question, let me start with you and then we can have David jump in. George is talking about some of the challenges around making the internal business case for specific procurement technology versus technology that is positioned more generally for the rest of the enterprise. And he really calls out the challenges around gaining alignment with IT for rolling these things out and integrating them where they need to be integrated. Can you provide your thoughts or tips for focusing or framing the pitch for quote unquote procurement specific solutions versus ones that are positioned a little bit more generally? And for a little bit of context, George works for a regional bank.
Mm-hmm. Good question, George. Yeah, that sounds like a deeper conversation. And getting to the business case and getting commitment in the organization is absolutely critical. A couple of things to think about right away. So it's two sides of the business case. One is the value proposition. The other side is the cost and what does it take, cost and time and effort, resource to get it done. That's really the foundation for the business case that you need to develop. On the value side, and we talked about already the different areas where procurement can drive value. So where are we talking about in the spectrum here? Are we talking about a foundational platform? Are we talking about a point solution? Are we talking about trying to bring in RPA? Each of those will have their own value proposition that would be unique based on where it would fit in the flow and how it connects to the end value. So it's hard to, without having further discussion, to know where that would fit. There's value propositions for each of those areas. On the benefit side, on the cost side, yeah, I mean that's a common barrier. Is, hey, we're going to need, certainly your foundational platforms. Gosh, we're going to roll out a source to contract tool. What's the IT investment that we're going to need to roll that out? But there's also a lot of tools and capabilities that are available that you can leverage without a big impact to the IT organization. Maybe that's an area that you want to look at. Whether it's leveraging a third party that can come in and help do that with cloud-based solutions that aren't going to have a direct impact, or maybe with a lightweight integration to back-end systems where you need to share a little bit of data. But where can you look at different solutions or point capabilities that can drive significant value without, at the same time minimizing the impact and the dependency on the IT organization? So I definitely encourage you to kind of look further into those kind of areas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And I know we've got 8 minutes left here, so I'm hoping we can come back one last time. But there's a couple of questions that I do want to ask to you both. And we've talked about what the future looks like. I'm always hesitant to ask kind of the crystal ball kind of questions, because as we've often seen within procurement, we perhaps move at a pace which is slower than what we may predict at a particular moment in time. But we have a lot of questions around that. So I just want to ask one more broadly. And that's, do you think we're going to be talking as a function about different technology in 5 years than what we're talking about today? So today we're talking more around, how can we make the procurement process more efficient? How can we enable more effective kind of consumer buying experiences? How can we have more access to the data that is buried within our ERP systems or wherever that may be buried, our invoices? Those are the questions we seem to have been having in this kind of generation of digitization, if you will. In 5 years, are we going to be talking about, these are all these things that we never thought was possible, and we've got all these wonderful startups coming through doing very different things? The question, are we going to evolve that conversation, or do you see it's going to be much of the same for the next few years?
David, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure. I think, look, if there's one thing we can learn just from our own history, is that there's no end to the technological journey. The technology will continue to change the way we do things and change the way we think about things. So we have to expect, I think, that's going to happen. I think some of the things that already exist, and obviously AI is such a powerful thing just in and of itself, as that becomes stronger and has greater application, I think we'll see it applied in many more areas, and also to a degree of depth that we have not seen to date. So whether that's we're already seeing the start of that with contract development, with RFP development. But I think it will, some of those things will continue to expand. But I think, again, it has to, the job of the procurement professional is going to really always be not trying to get to the end of a digital journey, but trying to ensure that whatever those advancements are, that we're embracing those in the context of our ecosystem, and that they're serving these objectives that we've defined and these strategies that we've laid out for our businesses.
Mm-hmm. What has me most excited, I think, over the next handful of years is going to be, how these technologies can really change the way that we do procurement. And you think about it, procurement hasn't changed for hundreds of years. Probably longer. And didn't know, David, I wasn't around back then, even though you may tell me that. But how do we fundamentally change that? Think about, like we talked about, e-auctions was an example. We talk about like the catalog. the P card, right, which changed the way, no longer you're submitting a purchase order and sending invoices. You're cutting out that process. So where are there going to be areas where these technologies are going to really change the way things are done? And, just to give you a couple of examples of some of the companies and technologies we've seen. As David mentioned, there's a company called Supply Hive that's using this crowdsourcing technology to basically become the Yelp for supplier performance, right? So what an innovative way to leverage that technology to change that game and change, get supplier performance out of spreadsheets. There's a company called Fair Market that has some great technologies, some AI-based tools that totally changed the game in the tail spin, which is a mess, and getting a hold of the tail, trying to make sense of it, and driving value out of it. So changing the way that you can approach things like tail spin. Legal Sifter is a company that we know in the contract spaces where they're changing the way that you can negotiate agreements, where you can take a supplier agreement, have the computer now do that contract review intelligently and cognitively to then play back to you, hey, here's where all the places that align to our standard template and terms. Here are some areas and some recommendations that you should then go back and negotiate. So again, think about that if you negotiate contracts, changing the way. Again, all of these examples really changing the way that we do procurement. And to me, that's the most exciting area.
Thanks for listening to today's Art of Procurement podcast. Now, to download the guidebook that accompanies this podcast and webinar, it's called A CPO's Roadmap for Digital Transformation. Just head on over to artofprocurement.com/Denali book. That's artofprocurement.com/Denali book.